And at the risk of sounding like a broken record in this video, you can't tell me that these two graphs don't look at least a little bit similar to one another. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. Today, we're talking about the market. More specifically, we're talking about the vintage market. And if you've been around in the Pokemon community for a while, you know that the market tends to go through a variety of market cycles where there's phases of booms, phases of busts, and then everything in between. Anyway, in this video, I was looking through a number of different data points on different vintage cards, and I started noticing a shocking trend. Now, the bubble cycle, the market cycle, cheat sheet is something that I think is really interesting because that's something we've seen play out over the last few years. And I would make the argument that I think we've finally reached a price floor for a number of these vintage cards. And from there, perhaps it's a return to normalcy as we start to see some price gains here in the future. So this might be the opportunity to switch mechanisms, switch modes from selling mode into potential buying? Maybe. That's what we're going to look at today. And what better metric to use for that than the cards that have seen the most volatile price swings, and that's the Charizard cards. So today, strap yourselves in. We're talking about the market floor, and the floor is definitely lava when it comes to these fire-breathing dragons. Now, before we get too engrossed in market data, I wanted to take you back for some historical context about the Pokemon market. Now, when I first started grading cards and buying and selling slabs back in 2011, what we saw as a community for about 4 years, 2011 to 2015, was a period of stable, steady, linear growth, organic growth. And I think a large reason why was there's a larger community of online collectors beginning to develop through online social media platforms like YouTube, E4, other forums and places that collectors could unify. However, in 2016, the global-wide phenomenon of Pokemon Go was released, and it took the market by storm, influencing Pokemon in a way that had previously been unseen since its initial release in 1999. So instantly, prices went up, there was hype all over, and that couldn't last. It came crashing back down in 2017 to 2018. Now, it is fair to say that those price floors realized in that down phase were higher than what they were prior to Pokemon Go, but they were noticeably down from the peak of 2016. After that, in 2019, we once again started to see stable, linear, organic growth, and that was really healthy for the hobby. But then the pandemic came in 2020 and pushed everything to new record highs, and many of you were around for that, and you know just how great the euphoria was. However, just like all things that go up, they must come down, and in 2021 to 2023, that's what we saw was pretty significant losses on a lot of those hyped vintage cards. However, as we're moving into 2024 now, I think what we're seeing is the stabilization of those price floors and perhaps even some starting to tick up once again. So could we be entering a new stable linear growth phase? Personally, I think we might, and perhaps the data bears that out. Let's check it out. So obviously, this is the most iconic English set card, and data is very limited when it comes to PSA 10 copies. There just hasn't been many sales, but they've stabilized roughly around $200,000, which is down from the last couple years. And I did notice that there was a recent sale for over $220,000, but again, we're taking averages throughout this video. The PSA 9 copy, however, has sold for about $20,000 2 years ago and kind of reached that price floor of about $17,500 and has presumably been on the rise again. Again, there's not a ton of copies out there being sold, but most recently selling for $22,000 at auction. Meanwhile, the PSA 8 copy has also seen a similar trajectory, kind of bottoming out around that $9,000 mark and slowly edging up to about $10,000. When it comes to this chart for the PSA 8 copy, I find this shockingly similar to that market cycles cheat sheet showed earlier, and I think that you'll find that that's one of the trends of this video. Next up, we have another base set Charizard, and this time it's the Shadowless Zard. And similar to its first edition brethren, there's just not enough market data out there for PSA 10 copies. What I was able to find, though, was about 2 years ago, this card was selling for $72,000. Last year for about $66,000. And there's really only one sale recently in the last 6 months, and that one was for $52,000. You guys will have to disregard the little tail at the end of this graph. There was a missed data point. That is going to be the case sometimes with these graphs provided by TCG Fish. The PSA 9 copy, though, is a bit interesting. It was $5,000 2 years ago, kind of floored out at around $4,000, and has been slightly ticking upwards again, averaging out at about $4,500. Similar could be said for the PSA 8 copy, which was about $2,000 2 years ago. Kind of hit that floor last year in 2023 at $1,800 and has stabilized around the $2,000 price point. Once again, the graphs for the PSA 8 and PSA 9 are strikingly similar to the market cycle cheat sheet I showed earlier, and even the new price floor that we're seeing is roughly aligned with that price peak just prior to the boom in 2020, which is something common of the market cycle graph to begin with, so I find that fascinating. Finally, from base set, we have to talk about the Unlimited Charizard, and thanks to its massive volume of sales, there are plenty of data points to use here. Now, the PSA 10 copy found a price floor of about $9,000 2 years ago, and since then has stagnated around $10,000, give or take a little bit. Now, the PSA 9 copy was about $1,200 2 years ago, and found its floor about $1,100 just last year in 2023, and in 2024 has rebounded just a little bit, going up to about $1,200. Now, the PSA 8 copy was $500 2 years ago, and that was the case about a year ago as well, but has been ticking up ever so slightly, about a 10% gain here in 2024. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record in this video, you can't tell me that these two graphs don't look at least a little bit similar to one another. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the first edition Dark Charizard from the Team Rocket set. Now, this one has been shifting downwards still a bit, and 2 years ago the PSA 10 copy was $4,000. About a year ago it was selling for around $3,500, currently settling around $3,250. Now, the PSA 9 copy has also been declining. It was $750 2 years ago, about $700 1 year ago, and it's found its floor, or is still finding its floor, around the $625 mark. Now, the PSA 8 seems to be stabilizing a bit better. It was about $450 2 years ago, and then since then has remained around the $400 mark. Again, the resemblance to the market cycle graph is pretty fascinating, but at least with the PSA 10 and PSA 9 copies of the Dark Charizard, there does seem to be a little bit more downward momentum happening, but perhaps we're getting close to that price floor for these cards. It's something we'll have to keep an eye on. Our next Charizard takes us to the Gym Challenge set with first edition Blaine's Charizard. Now, the PSA 10 copy was selling for about $4,200 2 years ago, and this one rose a little bit last year at $4,350 before declining and settling around $4,000 this year. Now, the PSA 9 copy was originally $1,000 2 years ago and seems to have increased a little bit and then stagnated there at about the $1,100 price point. Same could be said of the PSA 8, moving from $600 2 years ago and then steadying out at around $650 since then. One of the things I find interesting about the Blaine's Charizard is there's actually more data points, more sales for the PSA 9 copy than either the PSA 8 or PSA 10 copy. So I think it's a good indication, especially as we look at the long-term graph and zoom out a bit, where we can see that that price floor has been pretty stable for the last 2 years. So again, maybe that's a good indication that we're entering that growth phase, or will be soon here in the future. Next, let's shine a light on the first edition Shining Charizard, my personal favorite Charizard on this list. Now, in a PSA 10, this card was selling for about $11,000 2 years ago, before declining to about $10,000 last year, and that's pretty much where it's remained since. Now, the PSA 9 copy was about $3,600 2 years ago, and this one edged up a little bit last year to $3,700, before declining back down to that $3,600 territory. Now, the PSA 8 copy has been doing a lot better, especially recently, and this card originally was $2,200 2 years ago, and it's kind of remained stagnant there until recently, where it's been on a tear, going up to about $2,700. Now, the momentum of these three different charts tell three very different stories. The PSA 10 copy still has some downward price momentum to it, whereas the PSA 9 seems to have stabilized. On the other hand, the PSA 8 is actually increasing right now and has a nice little upswing there at the tail end. So we're getting some mixed messages from these Charizards, and I guess this is one of those situations where grade plays an important role. Next, let's bring out the fireworks with the reverse holographic Charizard from Legendary Collection. Now, this is an absolutely beautiful card, and it's going to cost you. How much? Well, in PSA 10 2 years ago, this card would have cost $12,000, but it's seen some gains since then. About a year ago, there was a copy of this card that sold for about $16,000, and I guess that's where it's remained because there just has not been much sales data for this card. In a PSA 9, we've also seen some gains. 2 years ago, this card was selling for about $2,800. Last year, going for about $3,200, and continuing the slight upswing at about $3,300 currently. The PSA 8 copy was about $1,700 2 years ago, bounced up to about $2,000 last year, and it swung back just a little bit, kind of finding the middle ground between the two at $1,850. One observation that I wanted to point out is this PSA 10 Charizard is probably the only one on the list that wasn't susceptible to the large price gains and crashes following the pandemic. This one has remained relatively stable since its highs back in 2020. Next up, we have a card from the e-reader series. This is the Expedition Charizard. Now, once again, there's not a lot of data for the PSA 10 copies of this card, and it's a very difficult one to grade. But what I could find was 2 years ago, this card sold for about $9,500. And then last year, there was a copy that sold for $8,000, and not much since then. Now, the PSA 9 copy was selling for $850 2 years ago, and then saw steady growth since then. Last year it was $900, and now currently selling for about $950. The PSA 8 copy was stuck around the $400 price point 2 years ago. That's where it remained roughly last year, and now currently for about $450. Again, that doesn't mean we're going to see another boom like with Pokemon Go or with the pandemic, but it would be nice to see a return to the stable, linear, organic growth that we've seen in some of those other growth phases in the past. Our second to last Charizard on this list comes from Skyridge, and this is the Crystal Charizard. Really unique card on this one. In a PSA 10, this card sold for $12,000 2 years ago and took a little bit of a dip last year at about $11,000. Currently, it's gained a bit, selling for about $13,000. The PSA 9 copy was selling for $6,000 2 years ago, made a little bit of gain last year at about $6,300 before declining back down to that $6,000 floor. Meanwhile, the PSA 8 copy was selling for about $4,700 2 years ago, where it remained through most of last year, and recently has been selling for slightly under that at $4,500. This is another one of those situations where all three copies of the card have settled for well above their pre-pandemic highs, and that's something that's pretty typical of these market cycles. We even saw it in 2016 after the Pokemon Go phenomenon, and perhaps that's what we're going to see moving forward, is that new price floor established, and again, that linear growth is what we're hoping for. And finally, that'll bring us to our last Charizard on the list, and that's the Charizard Gold Star card, which is a very difficult pull rate and an absolutely beautiful card. Now, in a PSA 10, this card was selling for about $20,000 2 years ago, and it declined a bit down to $17,500 last year, where it's pretty much remained. Again, there's a limited data set when it comes to these PSA 10 cards, especially for some of these more expensive chase items. The PSA 9, however, was about $3,700 2 years ago, and this one has seen some gains over the last couple of years. Last year it was selling for about $4,200, and this year it's seen about $4,500 as a price point. Now, the PSA 8 copy bounced around a little bit as well. It was selling for about $2,500 2 years ago. It remained there last year, and then this year it's been down just a little bit at $2,200. You'll see in our long-term price chart that the PSA 10 stops at December of 2023. That's simply due to a limited amount of data. However, the PSA 9 and the PSA 8 copies, although not selling for as much as they were at their pandemic height, have clearly established support and even seem to have found a little bit of rhythm there at the tail end. So what does all of this mean? Well, there's no doubt that there's been some significant market headwinds to Pokemon in the last few years, resulting from the pandemic influence, the boom, all the new collectors, the players, the media attention, the celebrity influencers, and the stimulus money entering the hobby. And with all that extra money comes volatility. We certainly saw that over the last few years as prices swung up really violently and have been regressing ever since. That's part of the market cycle. That's normal. And it's really fueled by the saturation of cards entering the market, but also the resulting consumer confidence. Once prices start to decline, people panic sell into the market, and then it becomes a race to the bottom. But now we're there. We're hitting that bottom floor and finding stability. And I think that's an indication of a healthier, stronger market moving forward. It's also worth noting that, at least historically speaking, in most markets, when you find a price floor, that's generally where the maximum opportunity is for collectors and investors. Now, I don't necessarily know if that's what this is, if this is a return to organic growth or not, but I'd like to hope so. And if we've seen one thing in the past with market cycles, this is generally how they tend to work. Charizard is just one component of that. It's just one Pokemon, and it's one of the more popular ones out there, but I thought it'd be a good case study to look at. Anyway, you guys will have to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below of what you think is in store for the Pokemon market moving forward into 2024 and beyond. Anyway, guys, I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all to stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun. That's what this is all about. We're collectors after all, and it's the joy. It's the love. We'll see y'all with the next video. Bye, everybody.